It was just like a huge blank, unknown part of the world, and the last part of Canada basically to be explored.
The Arctic Ocean north of the Queen Elizabeth Islands is covered by a layer of ice and snow that hides about 1/3 of Canada's offshore territory.
It was on the shores of northernmost part of Canada. Nobody had been there before to do any geological work because you can't get there by ship. There's too much ice.
Scientific exploration of this ocean and its seafloor has been severely hindered by its remoteness, by its harsh climate, and by the sea ice that covers the icy Arctic Ocean waters throughout the year.
Establishing Canadian presence in the Arctic islands was an issue at one time when there was disputes starting about the ownership of the Northwest Passage and that kind of thing, in addition to the knowledge that there were Russian submarines.
The question of how to study this remote Canadian frontier began to be answered in 1983 when a large block of glacial ice broke off the Wart Hunt ice shelf north of Ellesmere Island.
A consortium or cooperation of a few countries had just successfully operated an ice camp on sea ice. Now that's just a seasonal ice camp because the ice is too friable to last multi-seasons. The ice island, which is a 45-meter thick chunk of glacier ice, actually offered an opportunity to occupy a more permanent base. If we set up the infrastructure on the island, as it drifted about the Arctic Ocean, the opportunity was there to collect data.
It was part of a need to understand the evolution of the Arctic basin and initially to understand more about the petroleum and gas potentials of that part of Arctic Canada. So things were changing fast. We needed to know about the depths of the water in case ships were able to go there. And we had no information about the marine geology. And we had no idea of the structure of the ocean waters there at all.
It was ultimately chosen because it was large enough to occupy. It was about 3 by 5 kilometers and roughly kidney shaped. The site was chosen. The first step was a crew went in to build a runway, basically. Once you were able to get an aircraft landed, then you could start bringing in more and more supplies.
Before we could get in a bulldozer to help construct the runway, this was the real bottleneck. Cleaning a runway on the island was a tremendous amount of work.
The first tractor was a D9 in 1986, was dropped by a Herc, so parachuted in. You couldn't land an aircraft big enough on the island that could carry such a load, so it was actually airdropped.
Once larger planes could land, they could drop off tractor or skidoos and so on and so forth. That made life a lot easier. And the lumber for setting up some little a mess hut and a few like living quarters.
So initially it was just winter camping and a lot of work. By the first year though, by 1985, by the late spring, we were conducting science. We had the infrastructure in place to take measurements and take samples, and so things started to flow. The experience was there, the equipment was there, we knew what worked, what you could use in the Arctic. Even something as simple as a screwdriver, you can't take your glove off to operate a screwdriver because your hands would freeze. So you had to have tools that you could use with mitts, for example. So it was really based on a lot of previous experience that allowed you to do this at all. To go in green would be very difficult.
While it was a very sturdy and trustworthy platform for building a science camp, it took enormous resources and effort to drill a hole through the 45-meter thick chunk of shelf ice.
2 1.5 million BTU boilers heat glycol, which is circulated through a heat exchanger. Icy seawater is pumped through this heat exchanger where it reaches a temperature of about 95 degrees Celsius. The hot water is then used to melt the ice. It takes about 30 hours to melt the 1 meter wide hydro hole in the core lab. This hydro hole is positioned under the coring tower to provide access to the seabed and the ocean around it so that sampling can take place.
There were adaptations that were needed. For example, to do the marine geology program, all the equipment we had usually is run from a ship.
You had to lower equipment through a hole in the ice for 45 meters and not snag it up or bang it against the side of the ice, for example. So equipment had to be redesigned so that it was obviously more narrow and wouldn't snag up on the ice. I was principally on as PETA's technician, so I was a student at the time when I first went up. In the first season, at least, after everything was set up and things were operational, everybody else left, and I was left alone on the island. At least the lone geologist. There were still physical oceanographers and others there, but to run the sampling program for PETA and colleagues.
There were oceanographers working with us using the same space. So they drilled 2 other holes, and after doing their water sampling and so on, those holes were used to put down sediment traps that were anchored then or moored there. And we found some amazing tiny little plankton-sized creatures that we didn't even know existed there, and I'm still working on those. Because the ice has thinned so much, there's a huge need to know what creatures are being impacted by this and how. When we first put our coring instruments in on the cameras, we honestly weren't expecting to find anything under there except the smallest microscopic creatures living on the bottom. But to our huge surprise, we found these reefs of sponges. Not like the coral sponge reefs, but sponges like that, but made out of glass-like substance called silica. Those sponges were behaving in a different way from most parts of the ocean. Usually they get bigger when they get into deeper, colder water, but on the Canadian margin, they were getting bigger in the opposite direction. And we first were very puzzled by this. And what we put together was that this was because they like cold water, they're Arctic creatures, go figure. What we found was that the bottom water of Canada was getting warmer, and it was squeezing these creatures up. And we still don't even know if they've survived there. And because they provide silica for all these other grass of the sea to survive on, because the grass of the sea is the basis of the whole ecosystem, because the grass is eaten by the little creatures who are eaten by the fish, who are eaten by the whales, who are eaten by the bears, so it goes. You pull one of those rungs out of the ladder and the whole thing collapses. Finding that the sponge reefs were back in the 1980s already responding negatively to the warming of the oceans. So that was the first alarm signal, a canary in the coal mine.
There's, as I mentioned, a lot of people coming through doing different studies. Certainly just basic measurement of the water depths had never been done in much of this area. And those data have been invaluable to our Law of the Sea program even today. There were groups studying sea ice properties. The whole raison d'etre of the island to begin with was to conduct deep seismic experiments to understand the structure of the Earth in the Arctic, because there was no information. And even with that information, it wasn't until this past decade when we actually started to acquire enough information to really start to understand what makes up the Arctic and how it was formed and so on. There was a major program, geophysical program, to try and understand the composition of the Earth in that area, not just for petroleum exploration purposes, but just for scientific understanding and for understanding the Arctic and how the Earth formed. I have a colleague who said the Arctic is the last holdout on plate tectonic theory, because we don't know how everything fits back together in the Arctic. and people doing models of plate tectonics down south. Anything that doesn't fit, they just throw it to the Arctic because nothing fits there. So it's been an interesting area to work. I mean, a true frontier even to this day, but in 1985, yeah, unquestionably.
Other cooperative programs with chemical oceanographers involve collecting seawater for analysis of rare chemicals such as krypton and argon, or radioactive substances like strontium and plutonium.
One of the consequences in the Arctic, at least on the sea ice as it drifts around, is they transport nuclear fallout material, and in particular, Russia has their nuclear graveyard in the Kara Sea in the Arctic, and these nuclear tracers can be basically followed right back to the location of this nuclear graveyard. So there are signatures on the ice as well, and that was one of the studies that was really initiated in the mid-'80s. And some of it conducted from the ice island.
Some of the radioactive elements, like iodine and cesium, are indices of nuclear catastrophes, like the Chernobyl accident, and their distribution in snow, water, and sediments provides important clues to their pathways and rates of circulation in the global ecosystem.
Although PCBs had been prohibited from use in North America for some years, other countries in Asia, for example, had not prohibited the use. And there's some huge rivers that flow into the Arctic. So they were picking up these PCBs that were in the little critters Davis called the copepods, and the fish eat copepods, and the Inuit people eat the fish, and the breast milk of the mothers of a number of Inuit people were found to have these PCB contaminants and so on. So this was a crisis at the time of great concern. Sometimes connections with the rest of the world were very, very poor. We could get South America quite well. I remember that, listening to all this mariachi music and so on and so forth. But in terms of connecting with what's going on in Canada, and for us, more importantly, when is the next plane coming in or the next helicopter coming in with our supplies or to get us off this island after we've been there 6 weeks or 3 months or whatever?
The world doesn't recognize today, and that is the remoteness, because you did not have email. You couldn't pick up a cell phone and call, not even a satellite phone. You know, there was no way to communicate either with your office or your loved ones back home. And when planes came in, it was writing letters the old-fashioned way. You know, you sent letters home, and you hopefully got letters back if anyone cared to send you one. I got a care package once, which was a Mars bar and a Coke, and I thought I was in heaven. I was ready to go for another 3 months. So you just don't experience that remoteness today, not even on a ship anymore, because of satellite connections. You can email at will.
Field work in this harsh Arctic marine environment is demanding of physical effort, ingenuity, and constant vigilance for dangers ranging from whiteout blizzards to ice cracks and polar bears.
If you left camp, you had to usually go in pairs, and one person would have a gun, and you would learn to do the polar bear walk, which was take 5 or 6 steps and then do a 360 to have a look around to see if anything was spotted. There wasn't an abundance of wildlife because it's a thick chunk of ice. There wasn't any hunting to be done from that particular piece of ice.
So this blizzard comes up, and the situation was there was 3 places you tried to get to on the island on a daily basis to do your work. There was the laboratory, it was furthest away. Then in the middle, then there was what we call the mess hut, which is where you got food and coffee and tea. And then there were these little wooden huts where you slept. They were just little boxes. And the blizzard came up one night, so I was in the box. and sort of wait to open the door the next morning. Well, the door wouldn't open. That was the first hint that there was something really different there. But in this particular blizzard, it just, it never stopped, and it was absolutely relentless. So hunkered down in the box for another maybe 4 or 5 hours, and then, the need for tea or coffee or something. Yeah, I'm going out now. So out on hands and knees, using, what do you call it, body knowledge that the mess hut was over there somewhere, and hoping that, in fact, body memory was working, because you could not see anything. You're on your hands and knees and just crawling and crawling, till I could see the light of the mess hut, and I knew, in fact, that I was crawling in the right direction. That was what it was like. The environment was like so completely different from anything I'd ever experienced. And you notice this impacts you even more when you come back, that you've been on the ice for 6 weeks, and the air there, the air was incredibly clean. When you came into Baffin Bay, for example, and particularly once you hit the forested areas, the smell of the earth, you had to reconnect with that, because you lost all that sensory perception while you were up there on the ice, where most of the time you're just seeing white on white on white with bits of blue here and there.
Coming out was a sensory overload, right? When you came south, you land in Montreal, it's like, shock. It's sensory overload.
This ice island is 45 meters thick and about 21 square kilometers in area. It forms a stable platform that may drift around the western Arctic Ocean for 10 to 25 years before melting.
Yeah, I think it was 1990. We pretty much closed everything down. So sadly, the island drifted up into the Arctic channels instead of blowing out into the Beaufort Gyre and circulating around the Arctic Ocean as we had hoped. I kind of gave a talk once, a public talk, and I broke Arctic exploration or scientific exploration into sort of 3 components. And one would be sort of the dog sled stage, where you go on a dog sled and you do the science from a lot of manual effort. And the second stage was kind of ice camp and ice islands. And then now with ice being thinner and more accessible, it's really into the icebreaker stage of research. So I think one of the last major efforts for us, at least, was Ice Island. So it's probably an era that's gone by us. It was a tremendous adventure. I mean, I go back in a second. It was a learning experience. I learned how to weld and do electrical and build things and run equipment. And I do regret that the island didn't have a longer history, that it didn't float out into the ocean. It's really unfortunate. It would have provided just such an amazing amount of data. Following on that experience, I had an opportunity to go on the first icebreaker to the North Pole, or at least the first non-nuclear icebreaker. And then, when UNCLOS did come along, I was perhaps well suited to work in that program, because I had a lot of experience in the ice already. It was great for me. I love going back to the Arctic. It's a wonderful place to work.
If you like this video, let us know with a thumbs up. Click on the logo below to subscribe to the Simply Science channel, and click the bell icon to be notified when we upload new videos.